Sky News understands that Soa murderer Ian Huntley has been seriously assaulted in prison. It's understood he was taken to hospital after being found in a pool of blood at HM Frankland in Durham following an attack by an unknown inmate. Huntley was convicted of the murders of 10-year-olds Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman in Surrey, Cambridgeshire, back in 2002, serving a life sentence with a minimum of 40 years. Let's bring in our correspondent, Sadia Chowdhury. Sadia, what more can you tell us?
Well, as you say, Huntley is serving a life sentence with a minimum of 40 years in HM Frankland in County Durham. And we understand that he was attacked today by an unknown inmate. He's serving that prison sentence for the 2002 murders of 10-year-old Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells. He's now 52 years old, and according to some reports, this is the fourth time that he's been attacked. The Sun newspaper reporting a 2018 incident, a 2010 incident and a 2005 incident, twice before attempts to slit his throat, they say. Huntley is said to be usually a very closely protected prisoner, but the Ministry of Justice has confirmed to Sky News that he was attacked by an unknown inmate. He was said to be found in a pool of blood on his prison wing with serious injuries.
Britain had already sentenced him to spend most of his life behind bars. But for one prisoner inside a maximum security workshop, that was never enough. On a cold February morning in 2026, Ian Huntley, the man whose name became permanently linked to one of Britain's most devastating child murder cases, bent over a recycling station inside HM Prison Frankland and never saw the first strike coming. 15 blows, a spiked metal weapon, officers running, prisoners shouting. And yet, the most disturbing question came later. Was this sudden violence? Or had something inside that prison been building for years? This is Crime Case Examiner, where we examine the criminal mind, the hidden warning signs, and the moments where justice becomes something far more complicated. And in today's case, the final hunt. Inside the prison, death of Britain's most hated child killer. If you follow true crime that goes deeper than headlines, subscribe now, and while you watch, tell us where you're watching from, because this case still divides opinion wherever it is discussed. Now, let us get into it. To understand what happened inside that prison workshop on February 26, 2026, you have to go back 24 years, to a summer evening so ordinary it became unbearable later, precisely because of how ordinary it was. August 4, 2002. 10-year-old best friends Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman stepped outside wearing matching Manchester United shirts, an image that would become one of the most haunting photographs in British criminal memory. They were not running away. They were not entering danger knowingly. And they were doing something children do every day. They were going to buy sweets. The route was short. Familiar roads, familiar houses. The kind of walk children make when everyone around them assumes nothing extraordinary can happen in the space between one safe place and another. But that evening, one house on that route held a man whose psychological balance had already spent years developing beneath ordinary appearances. Number 5, College Road. And the man inside that house was Ian Huntley. Long before prison walls closed around him, Ian Huntley moved through life in a way that drew very little attention. That became one of the most unsettling truths ever uncovered about him. Nothing about his appearance suggested the level of darkness investigators would later associate with his name. Born in Grimsby in 1974, his early life did not produce the kind of dramatic childhood narrative that often dominates public imagination after notorious crimes. There was no single violent incident people could point to years later. No obvious explosion of cruelty in public view. No notorious teenage arrest that marked him out early. Instead, there was something quieter, something more difficult to detect. A pattern of drifting. He passed through ordinary jobs without building a stable direction. Friends and acquaintances often described him in ways that sounded almost empty, quiet, unremarkable. The kind of man who could stand in a room without leaving much impression. That absence of impression would later become one of the most dangerous parts of his psychology. Men who appear forgettable are often granted a kind of social invisibility. People stop examining them closely because there seems to be nothing urgent to examine. But beneath that ordinary exterior, warning signs had already begun appearing. Across the late 1990s, allegations involving young women and teenage girls began surfacing around his name. Complaints were made to police. Some involved sexual aggression. Some described coercive encounters. Some involved allegations serious enough to suggest that what looked like isolated incidents might actually represent repeated predatory behavior. But the cases never formed a single visible warning system. Different police forces held fragments of information. Complaints were recorded in separate places. No unified pattern emerged inside the institutions that were supposed to notice one. Again and again, allegations surfaced. Again and again, they faded into administrative silence. This would later become one of the most painful conclusions of the entire case. Not simply that a dangerous individual existed, but that pieces of his behavior had already been visible before the crime that shocked Britain. And still no system had assembled those pieces into something actionable. By the time Huntley reached adulthood, he had become highly practiced at presenting normality. Not charisma in the classic sense. Something subtler than that. A controlled, low-pressure ordinariness. The kind of social behavior that lowers suspicion precisely because it offers so little intensity. Forensic profilers often note that certain offenders survive socially by reducing themselves into forms people do not instinctively fear. They do not need to charm entire communities. They only need to appear manageable, safe enough, harmless enough, forgettable enough. And Huntley understood that instinctively. He learned how to speak calmly when questioned, how to remain emotionally measured in ordinary interactions, how to project the mild awkwardness of someone ordinary rather than the volatility of someone dangerous. In many later accounts, people struggled with one same phrase. He never looked like someone capable of what happened later. But hidden beneath that social flatness was another psychological pattern. Resentment without obvious release. Men who privately accumulate grievance while publicly performing normality often become deeply dangerous because their internal world develops separately from their visible one. Rejection becomes humiliation. Frustration becomes entitlement. Small losses become emotional injuries that demand private compensation. By the early 2000s, Huntley had relocated to Soham, a small Cambridgeshire town where life moved with the kind of trust small communities often carry without noticing it. It was the sort of place where children crossed short distances independently, where neighbors recognized one another, where ordinary routines created an atmosphere of security. There, Huntley found another ordinary role: school caretaker. It was a position of practical trust, keys, access, familiarity, presence around school spaces. Nothing dramatic, nothing that immediately alarmed anyone. Yet what would later horrify the public was how close he had come to that role despite the warning signs already attached to his name. His relationship with Maxine Carr added another layer to the appearance of normal life. Carr was warm, sociable, well-liked, and worked as a teaching assistant. People trusted her easily. Through that relationship, Huntley's own presence often appeared less threatening. Which brings us back to that August evening in 2002. Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, two 10-year-old best friends, going to buy sweets. Later, when investigators rebuilt the final known movements, one location returned again and again. Number 5, College Road. The house Huntley shared with Maxine Carr, though Carr herself was away visiting family that weekend. Huntley was alone. What investigators later established is that both girls entered that house alive. No eyewitness saw them cross the threshold. No camera captured the final approach. But forensic evidence all drew the same line back to that front door. Inside the house, whatever happened unfolded quickly enough that no alarm reached outside. No cry heard by neighbors ever became decisive evidence. No immediate disturbance brought anyone to the door. And because Huntley never gave a full, truthful account, what happened inside remained partially sealed behind contradiction. At different stages, he altered details, shifted timelines. Each version attempted to reduce intention and increase accident. That pattern itself became psychologically revealing. Offenders who improvise after violence often betray themselves not simply by what they deny, but by how carefully they try to explain ordinary details while avoiding decisive ones. And investigators found certain areas of the house showing signs of cleaning inconsistent with normal domestic behavior. Certain traces remained despite efforts to erase them. Forensic evidence linked both girls directly to the property. That is often where psychology becomes louder than words. The gap between what evidence shows and what the suspect insists happened. Prosecutors later argued that after the girls died, Huntley moved with cold efficiency. Bodies were placed into his car, not abandoned nearby, transported. He drove away from Soham toward a remote area near RAF Lakenheath. There, investigators concluded, he disposed of the bodies in a ditch concealed enough to delay detection. Clothing was removed, burned. Attempts were made to destroy evidence. Even there, his actions suggested layers of thought. What to burn, what to remove, and what to leave. Psychologically, offenders acting in blind panic often abandon detail quickly once distance is created. Huntley did not. He continued making decisions. That is why prosecutors later emphasized calculation over accident. Because each stage after death required renewed action, he had opportunities to stop. Instead, he continued. And then came perhaps the most psychologically disturbing decision of all. He returned home, not fleeing, not disappearing, returning directly into the center of public concern that was only beginning to form. Because while two families were starting to realize something was wrong, Huntley was already preparing for a role no one yet understood he had chosen, the role of the concerned local witness. And the search for Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman had already begun to reshape Soham by the time Ian Huntley stepped into public view. At first, the town moved the way small communities always move when children fail to come home, quietly, then urgently, then all at once. Parents checked familiar routes. Neighbors called names into streets that only hours earlier had felt safe. But as daylight faded, ordinary explanations began collapsing. And in that atmosphere, Ian Huntley made one of the most psychologically revealing decisions of the entire case. He moved toward the center of concern, not away from it. He did not isolate himself. He did not avoid conversation. Instead, he entered the emotional landscape of the search with remarkable calm. He spoke to officers early. He volunteered information. And then he did something that would later become almost impossible for many people to watch without discomfort. He stood near grieving families and spoke publicly as though he were another worried local resident trying to understand what had gone wrong. Television cameras arrived quickly. Huntley understood that cameras were not simply recording facts. They were recording emotional tone. And his tone remained controlled. His voice stayed measured. His face remained composed. He described concern with the kind of restraint that appeared almost practiced. He spoke of sympathy. He spoke of shock. He even suggested to investigators that he may have been among the last people to see the girls alive. That statement, in another context, might have sounded helpful. In reality, Yurtsid placed him dangerously close to the timeline investigators were still trying to build. What unsettled later profilers was not that he spoke. It was how naturally he appeared able to inhabit concern while knowing exactly where the girls were and exactly what had happened hours earlier. Certain offenders do not disappear after violence because proximity offers something psychologically valuable: influence. By remaining visible, they hear what others know. By joining grief, they monitor the emotional direction of suspicion. By speaking calmly, they test whether their performance still works. And Huntley appeared deeply comfortable doing that. He attended moments where anxiety was thick enough to be physically felt. Families stood in visible distress. Volunteers searched open ground. Yet through all of it, Huntley maintained an extraordinary steadiness that investigators later revisited repeatedly. He did not look like a man collapsing under fear. He looked like a man performing normality under pressure. The distinction matters because genuine fear often leaks through unpredictably. Voice shifts, fragmented speech, avoidance, emotional inconsistency. Huntley instead offered something flatter: a controlled emotional register, enough concern to sound human, not enough to appear unstable. At first, that calm helped him. Police were dealing with massive public pressure. Hundreds of leads arrived quickly. Witness statements multiplied. But calm becomes suspicious when facts begin tightening. And slowly, very small inconsistencies began emerging. His timings shifted. Descriptions altered. Minor details around his movements did not remain stable. Nothing dramatic at first, just enough friction to force investigators back toward him again. That is often how performance begins to fail. Not through one collapse, but through the accumulation of details that no longer hold together under repeated scrutiny. As the inquiry intensified, forensic teams entered No. 5 College Road with greater focus. Once that happened, performance alone could no longer protect him. Because physical evidence does not react to public composure. Traces recovered inside the house contradicted innocence. Forensic findings linked both girls to the property. And once that happened, the calm local witness became the central suspect in a crime already horrifying the entire country. When Huntley was arrested, the psychological distance between who he had appeared to be and what police now believed had happened became one of the most disturbing elements of public reaction. Because people had watched him speak. They had watched him stand close to grief. They had watched him offer sympathy while investigators later argued he had already cleaned, transported bodies, burned clothing, and returned home before the search had even fully begun. That transformation, from visible helper to convicted killer, never left public memory. In December 2003, after one of the most watched criminal trials in Britain, Ian Huntley was convicted of murdering Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term later set at 40 years. And Maxine Carr was convicted separately for perverting the course of justice after providing him with a false alibi. But prison did not reduce what his crime meant inside the hierarchy of violent offenders. Because certain crimes carry a status even among murderers, a status so toxic that a man enters prison already marked, and child murder sits at the very top of that internal hatred. Inside prison culture, men convicted of crimes against children often become permanent targets. Their sentence does not end with the court. It follows them into every corridor, every transfer, every meal line, every workshop, every unlocked minute. For Huntley, prison became a long sequence of managed survival. The first years required extreme protective arrangements. His identity was already universally known. Officers understood that anonymity was impossible. Other inmates did not need introductions. They knew exactly who he was, and many believed that attacking him carried status. Years before the final assault that would later end his life, violence had already reached him repeatedly. In 2005, another inmate threw boiling water over him, causing serious burns. The attack was fast, deliberate, and symbolic. The kind of prison violence designed less to kill than to scar and humiliate. Later, in 2010, he suffered one of the most serious assaults of his sentence when a prisoner armed with a sharpened weapon slashed his throat, opening a deep wound that required emergency treatment and more than 20 stitches. Each attack reinforced the same reality. Prison had not forgotten what he had done. And psychologically, repeated targeting changes how long-term prisoners think. Over time, prison staff and prison sources described Huntley as increasingly suspicious, withdrawn, and heavily controlled by fear of being harmed. He reportedly became deeply cautious about food, suspicious that something handed to him openly might be contaminated. Packaged canteen items became psychologically safer because they reduced uncertainty. He trusted little, he socialized less, he monitored ordinary routines for threat. The psychology of long-term hated prisoners often becomes dominated by hypervigilance. Every movement behind them matters. Every unfamiliar prisoner matters. Every shift in routine feels dangerous because in prison, danger often arrives disguised as normal routine. By later years, Huntley's existence had narrowed into managed caution. Even movement into workspaces carried risk. Which brings us back to February 26, 2026. Well, that morning inside HM Prison Frankland, one of Britain's highest security prisons, Huntley was working in a recycling workshop, a controlled environment where inmates handled materials under supervision. Frankland already housed some of the country's most notorious violent offenders, including men serving whole life orders for multiple murders. Among them was Anthony Russell, already serving a whole life sentence for multiple murders and rape. The workshop that morning appeared routine enough from a distance. Bundled waste, sorting stations, industrial rhythm. Prison routine depends on repetition, because repetition creates predictability. But predictability inside high-security prisons is fragile. According to reports that emerged later, Huntley bent forward while tying material around waste bundles. Behind him, Russell had enough time, enough proximity, and, most critically, enough access to an improvised weapon. The first blow landed without warning. A metal bar altered into something far more dangerous, spiked, heavy enough to fracture. The first strike was followed almost immediately by another. Then another. Witness accounts described rapid, repeated blows aimed at the head, not random movement, not panic, but concentrated violence. Prison officers ran toward the disturbance as prisoners shouted. By then, severe damage had already been done. Reports later described catastrophic head trauma, injuries so severe that by the time Huntley reached hospital, he had suffered irreversible neurological destruction. Some reports indicated he had also lost his sight before life support became the only thing maintaining survival. And inside Frankland, one question spread almost immediately. How had a weapon capable of that damage existed long enough inside a maximum security workshop to be used repeatedly before intervention? Because prisons like Frankland operate under strict control precisely because inmates housed there often have nothing left to lose. That question became larger when reports suggested Russell shouted words to the effect of claiming responsibility immediately after the assault. A man already serving a whole life order had no practical sentencing advantage to consider, no reduced future to protect, no parole horizon to preserve, which made motives psychologically colder. If punishment no longer alters a man's future, violence becomes expressive rather than strategic. Status, hatred, personal grievance, or prison mythology. The belief that attacking certain prisoners creates a kind of notoriety inside prison walls. Some later reports suggested tension may already have existed between the two men, including claims that Huntley had been antagonizing or bullying Russell inside prison routine. Those claims remained secondary to the legal process, but they added another layer to understanding why violence may have chosen that exact moment. Huntley was taken to Newcastle's Royal Victoria Infirmary with devastating injuries. For days, machines sustained what his body could no longer do independently. The public reaction outside prison split sharply. Some saw only the man convicted of killing Holly and Jessica and felt no sympathy. Others focused on another uncomfortable truth. Prisons are required to hold sentence under law, and not permit private execution inside controlled institutions. On March 7, 2026, after more than a week on life support, Ian Huntley died at age 52 after support was withdrawn when his condition deteriorated beyond recovery. Then came court. Anthony Russell appeared by video link days later. No dramatic speech. No visible emotion. Identity confirmed. Charge acknowledged. No plea entered at that stage. Just silence inside a short hearing, where legal process moved with striking plainness, considering how emotionally charged the case had already become. A pre-trial hearing was scheduled to continue the case forward, and that silence produced its own psychological weight. Because silence from a man already condemned for life often says something difficult, explanation may matter less to him than action already completed. Now the debate widened beyond the courtroom. Was this prison justice in the eyes of inmates who believed certain crimes remain unforgivable forever? Or was it prison failure, another example of a system unable to fully control violence even under maximum security? Because Britain had already sentenced Ian Huntley. The law had already fixed his punishment. Yet inside one workshop, another prisoner decided that sentence still felt unfinished. Two girls left home for sweets in August 2002. 24 years later, the man convicted of killing them died violently behind prison walls. But even after convictions, prison years, public hatred, and now death, one truth still remains difficult to escape. Inside that house on College Road, there are moments only one man ever fully knew, and he took some of those answers with him. What do you think? Was this justice or another failure of the system? Share your thoughts below. If this case affected you, please consider subscribing for more in-depth true crime analysis. And remember, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. Two names that should never be forgotten.